In August 1921, American workers were bombed from the air, not in a colony, not in a territory. In West Virginia, on American soil, by aircraft paid for by American coal companies, dropping gas bombs and improvised explosives on American citizens who had gone on strike. That fact has never fit comfortably into the story this country tells about itself, which is probably why most people have never heard of it. This is the Battle of Blair Mountain, the largest armed labor uprising in American history, and the war that got buried. To understand what exploded in those mountains, you have to understand what coal was to early 20th century America. The country wasn't just growing. It was transforming at a speed the world had never seen. Steel mills, railroads, electric plants, cities doubling in population inside a single generation. And underneath all of it, feeding the furnaces and engines that made everything run, was bituminous coal. The kind that came out of West Virginia. The kind that men pulled from the earth with their hands and their bodies. The coal fields of the Appalachians were not just an economic resource. They were a controlled geography. The land belonged to coal companies. The railroads belonged to the same financial interests that owned the mines. The towns that grew around the mine shafts were not towns in any civic sense. They were company property. Every house, every store, every road, every school. The operator didn't merely employ the miner. He owned the ground the miner stood on and the walls he slept inside. In many of these operations, wages weren't paid in United States currency. Workers received scrip, tokens issued by the company, redeemable only at the company store, at prices the company set. A man could work a full week in the dark and come out owing more than he earned. The debt didn't free him. It anchored him, leaving required resources most of them didn't have. Organizing, the one act that could change the structure, was the most dangerous thing a worker could attempt. The operators of the southern West Virginia coal fields were not, for the most part, local men. They were financial interests headquartered in Philadelphia, New York, and Baltimore. Investors who had bought up mineral rights in the Appalachians after the Civil War, often from families who didn't fully understand what they were signing. By 1900, a handful of corporate entities controlled millions of acres in a region where most people had lived for generations as subsistence farmers. You didn't have to be cruel to run this system. It was designed so that maximum extraction required minimum investment in the people doing the extracting. When miners tried to organize through the United Mine Workers of America, the EMWA, the response was swift. The coal operators contracted the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, a private enforcement firm out of Virginia that specialized in one thing: making unions disappear. Baldwin Felts agents didn't investigate crimes. They surveilled organizers, evicted families from company houses, and made sure the county's legal apparatus, the sheriff, the deputies, the courts, worked in the operators' interest. In Logan County, that arrangement was so complete it had a name. Don Chaffin, sheriff of Logan County. Chaffin's office was funded substantially by the coal companies. His deputies were numerous. His budget extraordinary for a rural county, and his authority over who could enter Logan County, who could organize, who could speak, was nearly absolute. He wasn't corrupt in the way that implies personal weakness. He was effective. He was the mechanism by which an entire county was kept union-free, and he understood his role with clarity. The workforce on the other side of that structure was never homogeneous and was never treated as though it were. Appalachian-born white miners, many of them descendants of families who had been in those mountains since before the Revolution, had lost their land and their independence to the same corporate consolidation that built the coal camps. Immigrant workers from Poland, Hungary, Italy, and a dozen other countries had arrived with different languages and different expectations and been sorted into the same company housing, the same debt cycles, the same darkness underground. And then there were the black miners. Workers who had migrated from the deeper South, many of them specifically recruited because operators believed they could be used as strikebreakers and paid less, had become a substantial part of the southern West Virginia coalfields workforce. They did the same work, died in the same accidents, lived in the segregated sections of the same company towns, and carried the added weight of existing in a country that formally denied them most of the rights it extended to anyone else. The year of Blair Mountain was also the year of the Tulsa Race Massacre. The year a prosperous black neighborhood in Oklahoma was destroyed by a white mob with the assistance of state authorities. That's the country these men were living in. Keep that in mind when you hear what they decided to do. A working day in a southern West Virginia coal mine began before light, often with a walk of several miles to the entrance, then 10 or more hours in tunnels that could be 4 feet high, bent at the waist, in dust, in heat, in the dark, except for a carbide lamp, followed by the walk back. If nothing went wrong. If something went wrong, it was a roof fall, a gas explosion, a runaway coal car, a mishandled shot of black powder. Federal records from this period didn't dispute the numbers. Hundreds of American miners died in work accidents every year. Black lung coal workers' pneumoconiosis wasn't something most operators formally acknowledged. It was simply the condition of a man who had worked underground long enough. A union contract meant the right to have your own representative present when coal was weighed, which directly affected your pay. It meant a set wage structure. It meant some mechanism to challenge dangerous conditions before they killed someone. It didn't mean luxury. It meant the difference between a system where the operator's word was the only law and one where you had a documented right to exist as something other than an instrument of production. Mary Harris Jones had been organizing in coal camps since the 1890s. By the West Virginia conflicts, she was in her 80s. She walked into the Paint Creek and Cabin Creek strikes in 1912 and spoke to crowds of exhausted miners in terms that cut through every layer of institutional language. She called operators criminals with the same ease she called government officials cowards, and she did it in the voice of a grandmother, which made it harder to dismiss. The coal operators tried. During the 1912-1913 conflicts, she was placed under military custody. She was in her 70s. They arrested a woman in her 70s to quiet a coal field. That tells you something about what she represented. The Paint Creek and Cabin Creek strikes also established a precedent the operators would remember. The state's authority could be directed against workers as effectively as against any other threat to order. When the governor declared martial law, he wasn't protecting miners. He was breaking them. Sid Hatfield was the chief of police of Mattawan, a small town in Mingo County, at the center of the coal fields. A local man with local authority who, when the moment arrived, didn't align with the operators. In May 1920, Baldwin Felt's agents came to Mattawan to evict miners and their families from company houses. Hatfield refused. The confrontation that followed happened in the street, in broad daylight. When it was over, 7 Baldwin Felt's agents were dead. So was Matawan's mayor. So were 2 miners. Those seconds in a West Virginia rail town became the spark that a decade of accumulated pressure had been building toward. Hatfield became what the coal companies feared most, proof that their control was not total. A local man with a badge who had looked their hired enforcers in the eye and said no. They had to get rid of him. On August 1st, 1921, Sid Hatfield and his associate Ed Chambers arrived at the McDowell County Courthouse for a legal proceeding. They were unarmed. Baldwin Felt's agents were waiting. Both men were shot dead on the courthouse steps. The agents were not convicted. When word spread through the mining communities of southern West Virginia, the march that had been building for months became something that couldn't be called back. The march began in Kanawha County in late August 1921. By the time it reached Blair Mountain, Estimates put its size somewhere between 10,000 and 13,000 men. This was not a demonstration. It was a military formation moving through mountain terrain, organized into columns, men designating roles, armed with rifles and shotguns they owned, because in Appalachia in 1921, a working man's rifle was often the most valuable thing he had. Many of those men were veterans of the First World War. They had learned in France and Belgium what infantry movement through contested terrain looked like. Some had served under black officers. Some had come home to find that the service they'd given their country hadn't changed what the country offered them in return. They wore red bandanas around their necks, an identification marker, so that in the confusion of the woods, men on the same side could recognize each other. Thousands of armed men moving through mountain forest toward a defended ridge. On the other side of Blair Mountain, Don Chaffin had organized a defensive line approximately 6 miles long, running along the ridge line. His force, deputies, private guards paid by the coal companies, and volunteers, numbered around 2,000 men. Machine gun positions on the high ground, communications, resupply, and aircraft. The planes were provided by coal operators. They flew over the advancing miners and dropped what the historical record describes as gas bombs and improvised explosive devices. American workers on American soil were bombed from the air by aircraft financed by American corporations during a labor dispute. That sentence still doesn't fit comfortably into the national story, which is precisely why it needs to be said out loud. The fighting lasted approximately 5 days. Ridge by ridge, hollow by hollow, men firing from tree cover, behind rocks, across distances that sometimes made the enemy invisible. No single decisive battle. Dozens of firefights along the length of the defensive line. The miners had numbers. Chaffin's forces had the high ground. What ended it was not a military defeat. President Harding federalized the response. U.S. Army troops arrived. With them came Army Air Service planes, federal aircraft, not company planes. The uniform of the United States. For most of the veterans in those columns, the calculation changed immediately. They had been willing to fight company men and county deputies. They were not, most of them, willing to fire on the uniform they had worn in France. The march dissolved. Men buried their rifles in the woods. Many walked home. Many were arrested. The final death toll is not precisely established. Sources give figures ranging from 20 to over 100. That uncertainty is itself worth noting. In a conflict of this size, on American soil, in 1921, the dead were not carefully counted in a way that survived. Several hundred miners were indicted. The charges included murder and treason. Treason against the state of West Virginia. That word was not chosen carelessly. It wasn't the language used for strikers. It was the language used for enemies of the state, which told you exactly how the operators and their allies wanted this event classified in the public record. Not a labor dispute, an insurrection. Not workers asserting rights, but citizens who had forfeited them. Almost none of the charges produced meaningful convictions. Juries drawn from the region understood what the conflict had actually been about. But the legal proceedings drained time, money, and the organizational energy the UMWA had spent years building in southern West Virginia. The Union's presence in the region was effectively dismantled in the years that followed. The men who returned to the company towns came back to the same houses, the same stores, the same debt, the same supervisors. Some were blacklisted, some left. Many stayed because the mountains were home, and because leaving required what most of them didn't have. The people who appear least in the standard accounts paid the fullest price without receiving even the symbolic credit that comes from being named as combatants. The black miners who marched made that decision in 1921, the year of Tulsa. The year when picking up a rifle meant something different, cost something different, for a black man in America than for anyone else in those columns. Their choice deserves more weight than it typically gets. The immigrant workers, men from Poland, Hungary, Italy, whose names appear on Union cards and arrest records, but not in commemorative accounts organized and marched in a country where their belonging was still conditional. The women who maintained the strike camps, who fed and sheltered men through months of mounting tension, who refused to vacate company houses when deputies came, they held the social structure of the resistance together, without rifles, which is why they're mostly absent from the historical record. The direct line between Blair Mountain and what came after isn't clean. It never is. But the documented suffering of the West Virginia coalfields was part of the accumulated evidence that the existing system could not hold. When Congress passed the National Labor Relations Act in 1935, establishing the legal right of workers to organize and bargain collectively without being fired, evicted, or shot, the legislators who passed it knew what had happened in those mountains. The UMW became one of the most powerful unions in the country. The organizational structure built in the years between Blair Mountain and the New Deal made that possible. In 2009, Blair Mountain was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It was removed less than a year later, following a boundary revision that historians and preservation advocates have contested ever since. Coal mining interests were involved in the removal. The fight over the physical site of the largest armed labor uprising in American history is ongoing. It is, in that respect, a continuation of the original conflict by other means. The miners who marched weren't marching for an abstraction. They marched because Sid Hatfield had been killed in broad daylight on courthouse steps, and nobody was going to be held accountable, because their neighbors had been thrown from their homes for attending a union meeting, because men they worked beside had died in explosions the operators recorded as accidents and moved past. They marched because the weight of a system that treated their lives as operational costs had finally reached the point where armed resistance, uncertain, dangerous, potentially fatal, looked rational by comparison. That is not a lesson. It is a fact of record. The ridge at Blair Mountain is still there. The trees have grown back. Most of the men who fought there have no marker.